It was a warm spring evening in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, when Reverend William Huffman's telephone rang. He glanced at his clock. It was 9:30. Why would someone call at 9:30? Fearing the worst, he answered. He knew the voice at the other end. It was the sheriff. And the sheriff wanted to know if Reverend Huffman would accompany him to the site of an accident. Why, he wondered aloud. It was to perform last rites. There were casualties at the accident. Reverend Huffman asked what type of accident, and he was told it was a plane crash. And would he mind if the sheriff picked him up? The Reverend was a well-respected man in the community, a kind and quiet man, and if he was needed, he wanted to be there. How could he say no? It never occurred to him to say no. Reverend Huffman turned to his wife, covered the receiver, and told her that he was going to be late. There had been a plane crash and he was needed. He told the sheriff he'd be waiting and hung up the phone. What Reverend William Huffman of the Red Star Baptist Church didn't know was that the events that would unfold over the next few hours would stick with him and the minds of many others for decades. Reverend Huffman couldn't predict that on a warm spring evening in April of 1941, he was going to have a strange encounter with aliens. It had been an uneventful 13-mile ride to the crash site. The sheriff couldn't tell Reverend Huffman much about the crash or how many casualties there were. But as they drew closer, he could already see what appeared to be a fire out in the field. It was a good quarter of a mile away, so he couldn't make out the cause of the fire, but he had a pretty good guess. With the warm April weather they'd experienced recently, the grass in the field was dry. It wouldn't take much to set it ablaze. The men made the trek through the field. As they got closer, the Reverend could make out an object in the glow of the fires. There were other men there, civilians and police, as well as medical emergency crews. All were waving flashlights, and all of them inspecting both the plane and other items scattered on the ground around it. Only it wasn't a plane. The Reverend could see that immediately. If it was a plane, it wasn't like anything he'd ever seen before. For starters, this plane didn't have wings, unless they'd been cleaved off in the crash. Furthermore, there was no plane in existence that was round and disc-shaped. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness and the flames, he could see the object that had crashed also had no seams on its surface. The surface was silver and metallic, and other than a large tear on the side, which it must have suffered upon impact, it was perfectly smooth. If he were asked, he would have to say what he was looking at was a saucer-shaped vehicle of some sort. Without asking, Reverend Huffman approached the tear on the side. From where he stood, he could see inside. There were metal chairs in there, of which he could see at least one, and on the instrument panel were levers and gauges in odd shapes. The dials themselves were labeled with strange hieroglyphic-like characters. None of it made sense. Was he looking at some sort of experimental aircraft? One that had suffered a malfunction which ended its test flight early? And what about the pilot? There wasn't just one occupant, he was told. There were 3 of them. He was led to the first 2, which were on the ground near the craft, and he was told that they were dead. When he saw them, he stopped dead in his tracks. The 2 bodies on the ground in front of him weren't human. They couldn't be. From his estimation, they weren't much more than 4 to 5 feet tall if they'd been standing, and they wore something which he described as wrinkled aluminum foil. But it wasn't that which told him the occupants weren't human. It was their bodies and their heads. They were hairless, and their ears as well as their mouths were small, much smaller than would be normal. They also did not have a protrusion for a nose, just 2 holes for nostrils. The other thing strange and disproportionate about their faces were their eyes. Their eyes were oval and large, much larger than they should be, and their fingers were long, as were their arms. It also seemed as if there weren't any discernible bone structure beneath their skin. And when their arms were adjusted, it was almost like the lifeless arms of a dead octopus. Could he perform last rites over something which wasn't human and possibly not even of this earth? He was then brought to the third body, which lay a little further away from the crash. This one, he was told, might not be dead, as earlier it was having trouble breathing. Now, before he could decide what to do about the entire situation, more people arrived. And he could see immediately that these were military personnel, and he guessed they were from the nearby base at Sykeston Field. They started to cordon off the area and cleared away any non-essential personnel, and that included Reverend Huffman. He was brought to the side and told in no uncertain terms that this was a national security matter and he wasn't to talk about it to anyone. Ever. Cameras were taken away, and those not of the military were sworn to secrecy. Reverend Huffman was an honest man, and he agreed to keep the events to himself. But he wasn't about to do so when it concerned his family. When he got home, he told his wife and 2 sons about what he saw. He asked them to keep it to themselves. He couldn't say what the ship was or where it came from, nor could he say anything about its occupants, but it would be best if the entire matter was forgotten about. They should go about their lives as if nothing had happened. After all, the cameras had all been confiscated and the remains and pieces of the ship were surely being removed and transported to a military base somewhere for safekeeping or to be studied. But he was wrong. He couldn't know that 2 weeks later, proof of what he had seen would literally end up in his hands in the form of a picture. It was 2 weeks after the crash that photographer Garland Frauenberger showed up at the Reverend's house. He was nervous and a bit frightened when Reverend Huffman let him in. It turned out the military hadn't retrieved all of the cameras that night. He'd managed to hold on to his, and the pictures that came with it. When he developed them, he was shocked to find that the picture he'd hoped would be there actually was, and it depicted exactly what he'd remembered, so he made a copy. He didn't want to be in possession of the only one in existence, and it was this copy that he gave to Reverend Huffman. And what was in the picture? 2 men and a body. To be more exact, it was 2 men holding up one of the dead occupants of the saucer for the picture to be taken, their hands beneath its armpits. This picture would remain in the Reverend's family for quite some time. He spoke no more about it, and when he died 18 years later in 1959, it ended up in the possession of his son. The story about the crash may have remained a family secret, except for the fact that one night at a dinner party, he showed the picture to his daughter, Charlotte. And what happened to that picture? Where is it today? According to Charlotte, when she was 10 or 11, her dad lent it to a close friend, and the picture disappeared. It was never returned, nor has it shown up in the years since. Neither has the original one taken by Garland Frauenberger. The story about the actual events behind the mysterious picture were unknown to Charlotte until 1984, when her grandmother was dying of cancer. It was during a brief respite in radiation therapy that the story and Reverend Huffman's involvement came out. Not wanting her grandfather's story to be lost to history, Charlotte began to tell people. After all, she had seen the photograph, and her dad himself had believed it all to be true. And then there was her grandmother's retelling of the account on her deathbed. If people didn't want to believe it, that was on them. In 1991, Leonard Stringfield, a UFO investigator and consultant at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, wrote about the crash. The accounts of what purportedly happened in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 were already in the public zeitgeist, and if what happened at Cape Girardeau was true, it preceded Roswell's supposed incident by 6 years. Interesting, right? But is it true? Perhaps if one of the 2 supposed pictures were to see the light of day, we might have the evidence we needed. Would that be enough, though? These days, almost anyone who spends a few hours with Photoshop could come up with a relatively convincing image, and the story itself was told to Charlotte by her grandmother. Granted, Charlotte did say she personally saw the photo herself years before knowing the tale behind it. But without physical evidence, we have only her story. And, interestingly enough, a notarized, sworn affidavit by the sheriff's brother who recalls there being a crash and his brother mentioning, quote, little people. It has also been reported that police records from the time mention a crash and that the debris was removed. If that is true, then where was it removed to? A resident who wrote a book on the subject believes the wreckage ended up in Washington, D.C. It is claimed by two women that their father, the Reverend Turner Hamilton Holt, was given a tour of an underground facility by then Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Reverend Holt told his family that he saw 3 non-human heads described as creatures preserved in jars and the wreckage of what looked to be some sort of craft. The sisters said this happened in 1939, but it could very well be that they were mistaken and that it was a couple years later and after the crash in Girardeau. Then again, it might mean nothing. Anecdotal stories aside, it would be out of character for the Reverend William Huffman to entirely make up what he said happened that long ago April evening in 1941. The truth may be somewhere in the middle, or it may lay in a secret room beneath the U.S. Capitol. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and leave a review. It really does help others find the show. And if you know someone who might enjoy the show, please tell them about it. You can find more information and references that went into this very episode by going to strangeencounters.org. I would really like to hear your suggestions for future episodes. And if you've had a strange encounter with something unusual or paranormal, I would love to hear about it. Visit the contact page for information on submitting your story. And until next time, please take care of yourself. It's a strange world out there.
After knocking your city, save, making show, I'm the solution of it, sir.